Today I'm going to be demonstrating these horses grazing in fog and rain. Hi, I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. Today's video is extra special. It is a collaboration with Leonardo from Fine Art Tips. He's got two channels, one in Spanish and one in English. I will have links to those along with his website in the video description. Leonardo drew out these horses and is going to show you step by step how to draw these horses freehand yourself, and then I am going to show you how to paint them. If you are subscribers over on Patreon, make sure to head over where I've got the real-time version of this painting available for you now. Leonardo also has a Patreon account where he's going to show you how to draw this horse in real time. The very first thing that you're going to want to do is go over to Leonardo's channel, Fine Art Tips, where he's going to show you exactly how to draw the horses for this painting. Now onto my painting. I'm working in acrylics. I am starting by laying this lavender color that I have mixed titanium white, Mars black, and a magenta color together to get. Now when you mix a grayish color like this, start by mixing the gray and then slowly add your additional color. Otherwise you tend to come up with too much color and not enough gray. So whenever I mix a grayish color, always the black, the white, get my gray where I want it, and then a little bit of whatever that additional color is. I'm using a mop brush there to blend that out. We're going to switch into real time because I want you to see how I transferred Leonardo's drawing onto my canvas. Once I got the background painted on there, I taped my tracing paper with the drawing onto my canvas, and now I'm using a piece of transfer paper. This one is by Low Cornell. It is white transfer paper and a small stylus, and I'll have links to all of these products below in the video description. And I'm just going to trace over my outline, and this is going to get my image perfectly, very cleanly onto my canvas. No eraser lines or anything. So even if you want to freehand something, I always like to draw it on another piece of paper, then trace it and transfer it onto the canvas to keep everything clean. And I just move my transfer paper around as needed. I don't need the transfer paper to be the exact same size as my project. I just move it where it needs to go. Now that my white outlines are there on my canvas, I'm going to go ahead and paint a base, kind of a grayish brown layer for my horse. This one in the background, he's not going to have much detail because he's so far back. There's going to be a lot of fog in front of him. Now the thing that I do need to keep in mind is that I need him to be quite a bit darker than the color it is on my reference photo, because when I airbrush the fog over everything, it's going to lighten everything up. So I need to make sure that my contrast is a lot higher than what that reference photo is to start with. Onto the blades of grass. The way that I am painting this is with a liner brush. I believe this is a number 2. It's either a number 2 or a number 4. This one is a synthetic hog-haired liner brush, and I am just loosely painting in my grass. Now the big thing when you paint grass like this, you don't want it to all be even from the top area to the bottom of the canvas. The reason is it will just look like a big wall of confetti. I want this to actually have a little bit of perspective and some depth in here, and so what I will do is once I start getting a little further into this, notice how I start breaking this up into almost rows, horizontal rows with the grass. And what that does is make it look like you're looking into the painting and not just this wall of brown confetti. The other thing is when I paint these, I'm making sure that all of these lines are slightly curved. I don't want them exactly the same, but they are just very slightly curved, and they overlap each other. They are formed into clumps and clusters. Very important in making a natural look. I'm softening up that back line on the horse in the distance. Back to the grass here. And this is a mixture of raw sienna with a bit of magenta. The darker areas have more magenta, and I do end up mixing in a darker brown as well when I get further towards the front. On some of these, especially when I move towards the back, I switch over to that grayish tone. The gray that I used in my sky is the same gray that I'm mixing into my raw sienna for the grass to tone it down so I get that grayish look as it fades into the distance. And when I come back through with the airbrush to create the fog, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the background area to make sure that that is much softer than what's up front. Don't worry, for those of you who do not have an airbrush, you can paint the fog without, and I will link you later on when we get to that point to a video where I show you how to paint fog without an airbrush. But for today's demonstration, that is what we will be using. Continuing to build up my rows. You can see they're not just lines everywhere. I'm really focusing on these different clumps and clusters of the grass. making some of these kind of curving sideways a little bit more. Again, making sure to keep that very natural. Now that the paint on the horse in the background has dried a bit, I'm adding more of a highlight, especially focusing on that his back line. I want that to be a very soft transition into the sky when I come back and airbrush that. I don't want him to have very, very harsh lines, not nearly as harsh as the horse up front will have. Again, going back to making sure that he looks like he's in the distance. I want his lines to be very soft. Moving back along on the grass. Now you can't really see the rows that I'm forming that much right now. You will later on. Now on these pieces of grass, I'm pushing a little bit harder with my liner brush. Yep, that is a number 4. I can tell now that I can see the whole thing. But I'm pushing a little bit harder. The harder you push with your brush, the thicker the line is going to be. If you want a really, really thin line, just barely let the tip of the bristles touch the canvas. If you want the thicker lines, you're going to push a bit harder. And this area being up close, those are going to be thicker strands of the grass, and so that's why I'm pushing harder. That also works when you're using bigger brushes. I can do, if you watch me paint, a lot of times you'll see where I'm using a very large brush but getting thin lines out of it. And that's just because of how I'm holding the brush and how much pressure I'm adding to the brush. And don't worry, if you're new and you feel like you're having a hard time controlling how thick and thin your lines are, how much pressure you add, that comes with time. The more you practice, the easier it will get to control how much pressure you're adding to that brush. Now with the other tip I have for you with the liner brush, I am using a fair amount of water mixed in with this. I don't want big, thick, chunky paint on that brush. You will not get thin lines with that. I do have a video showing you how to get thin lines. I will have a card pop up so you can check that out. But I've got a bit of water mixed in with this. Using a bigger brush to create thicker clumps on a few areas here, just so that I get a bit more variation and it doesn't look like I painted the whole thing with the one single brush. Now I'm going to start creating my rows. I'm using a lighter color. I've got a little bit of unbleached titanium white mixed in with the color I was previously using, and now I am forming those rows, those horizontal sections that I was talking about. And this is what's going to make it look like you're looking at flat land and not just this wall of brown confetti. I am making the same kind of brush strokes here where I'm not pushing very hard, and they are all slightly curved and overlapping each other. Very, very important. And as I paint these rows, I'm not trying to make them solid. I want to make sure that the previous strands of grass that I had painted, in this case the darker ones, are still showing through. I don't want just stripes on here. Really want to make sure that it's very sketchy feeling so that you can see the light and the dark sections. And on this type of brush, I want to make sure that the paint stays mostly on the front half of the brush so that I don't get a bunch of paint building up near the handle of the brush. Otherwise, it just makes a mess. The bristles don't stay close together. So as I'm working, I do have paint mostly focused on the front half of this paintbrush. I'm also using a very long paintbrush. That's important when you're using a liner brush. I know it's easy to think that the smaller the brush, the finer the detail, but that's really not necessarily the case. You want these longer bristles. They're going to give you much, much finer details. Now I'm going to outline the horse. This brown is way lighter than what I'm going to want. I just need a base coat here. I'm going to outline him first, going around the lines that I've already formed in there. Now, if you are having trouble where you're getting very bumpy edges, they're very rough, that usually means you don't have enough paint or enough water on your brush. So make sure, mix a little bit of paint, or if you're using a mixing medium, you can use that. Mix a little bit on your brush. When you're getting those dots where it's just a really rough texture, that's usually caused from dry brushing. The paint is too dry that's on your brush. So just add a little bit more paint, a little bit more water, and that should fix the situation for you. Not so much water that it's going to run all over the place, just a bit. Painting his tail in here, keeping it pretty sketchy. Getting the hint of his mane in the background there. Cleaning up the tail on the horse in the background, using my liner brush for that. Another thing that can cause you to have trouble where you're not getting very smooth brush strokes is the canvas that you're using. If you're using a canvas that is just, usually the cheap bargain canvases, those can be a real problem where the paint just kind of soaks into them. It doesn't really get into all the crevices. They can make it much, much more difficult for you to learn to paint. So if you're looking for a canvas, if you're trying to find a bargain, I recommend going with the Frederick's canvas pads. Those are wonderful for when you're first learning to paint. So you're not having to buy the whole canvas on the stretcher bars, but you still get the feel of a decent canvas that has a good gesso on it. So it makes it much easier, I think, for you to learn. And you can just tape that to a board as you're learning to paint. But they come in an entire pad of, like, I want to say it's about 10 sheets of canvas. So not terribly expensive. It's a really good way to get the feel of a decent canvas as you're learning. Much better than getting some of the cheap bargain canvases. Sketching in some of the green for the background there, and that's another area where I started with that grayish tone. I started with black and white and mixed a little bit of my green in there to get just that hint of color. Now I'm starting to add the shading on the horse. I'm darkening up the bottom section of all 4 of his legs and adding some of the shading on the rest of his body. Now here, I don't need this to be perfectly smooth. I'm going to be airbrushing over it anyway, but I do want my contrast to be a little bit harsher than what I need my end result to be. My end result needs to be very, very soft, but I still want to see some of the details in there. If I paint it how it is on the photo and then airbrush on top of that, I'm going to have even less detail than the photo does. So here, again, I'm going a bit darker on my horse than what you saw in that reference photo at the beginning of the video. And the same thing with the highlights. I want them to be a bit brighter than what it looked like on that photo, because this is all going to get lightened up quite a bit when I airbrush white over this. Building up more of those shadows, painting some of the little details on his face. I'm not going to go too detailed on this guy. Again, he's going to be in fog. You're not going to see a lot of detail. So I can go through this pretty quickly, just get a hint of where those shadows and highlights go. Adding some highlights on his tail there. And the shadow on that back foot. Want to make sure my edges stay very, very clean. Again, if they start getting fuzzy, add more paint and more water to your brush. Now we're adding some of the highlights. This is actually the same color that I used in the grass. That raw sienna with a bit of unbleached titanium white. I'm just adding the paint and smudging it out a little bit. And just like the shadows, I don't need this to be fully detailed. I just need a hint of where those highlights go. Now with this painting, if you are not interested in painting fog, you can make this same scene without airbrushing, and what I'm doing on the horse here would look like a finished painting. You don't have to add the fog if you don't want it there. But this video will show you how you can create that feel. Adding more of a highlight along the back there. And this brush is a little bit damaged. My bristles are no longer in the shape that they used to be in, but that's okay. It's still very useful for techniques like this. So even if you have a brush that you've damaged, hang on to it. You would be surprised at some of the techniques that I can only achieve with my damaged paintbrushes. So unless it's just big, thick, chunky paint and you can't use it at all, well, then it works almost like a palette knife. Hang on to your brushes in case you can use them in the future. Using a liner brush there to paint in his mane a bit more. Just curving that a little bit along the back of his neck. Adding some highlights to his tail, again with that liner brush. That is the number 4 synthetic hog-haired liner brush. And just adding some final details. Now, looking back, I think if I were to do this again, I probably would add a little bit more contrast, get my lights a little bit lighter and my darks a little bit darker on this, because you really lose so much of that when you do airbrush over it. It's easy to get into the mindset that you're painting it to be complete as it is, but you have to remember that when you're painting that fog, it's very opaque, so it's going to cover a lot of that. Now I'm pulling some of the dark colors, the same dark browns that I used in the horse, I'm pulling that into more of those rows that I was talking about in the grass, which again helps to build up the perspective here. If I did not paint this in, and you'll see this when I start airbrushing the fog, if I did not paint this here, all of the grass would just kind of look like one solid color. So it's very important that I get a lot of contrast in this. Now moving on to the airbrush section, I am using an Iwata Neo and white Createx airbrush paint, which has been thinned down with water, and just lightly going over everything. Now I am focusing a bit more on the background grass, making sure that that really looks like it's farther away in the distance, not putting nearly as much with the white airbrush paint up front. Lightly going over everything. Now this is something that you want to step back from a few times, because when you're sitting up front, you may feel like you don't have enough and really you have too much. So make sure to stop and step away from it and decide, do you need more or is it good where it is? If you do get to a point where you decide, you know what, I think I would like to have a little bit more contrast in mine, you can go back and paint over this. It's not like once you airbrush it, you can't change anything. You absolutely can. So in here, I will show you how to do that. I'm going to just take some more of the brown colors and add those back in there. And I'm smudging that. I'm adding it with one brush, and then I'm taking a clean brush and smudging it around just to create a bit more richness in the color here. I don't want to go too crazy, and I'll still come back through with the airbrush and soften some of this out too. So if it's not perfectly blended, it doesn't matter. The airbrush is pretty much going to do that for me. Now, if you do not have a full airbrush kit, you can still paint fog like this with a single action airbrush gun. Now, those don't work well for painting fine detail because you have no control over how thick or thin your lines are, but they will work for just misting a solid sheet of white like I've done here. And those ones, Badger makes one that's about $35, right around there. You can get those on Amazon, and it just uses a can of air instead of an air compressor. So if you like painting fog, that is definitely an option for you if you don't want the full airbrush setup. So you can see just pulling a few of these colors out, making my highlights a little bit brighter, getting some of the darker browns back in there. The brush I'm using right now is a Taklon bristled filbert. The tips are slightly rounded, and that makes it easier to hide my brush strokes. If you use a brush that has a very flat tip, those you can usually see where your brush strokes start and stop. They're great for painting straight lines, but when you're painting nature, these filberts are definitely my favorites. You can get very, very nice soft brush strokes. Now that that is done, I'm going to go ahead and airbrush a tiny bit more with the white, not too much. Once that's painted in there, I can get started on the rain. And with this is where I'm using that straight brush where I said the flat tip works really well for straight lines. Here we go. This is where that is very useful. This one is a Simply Simmons brush. This is a very flat brush, great for painting rain. And I'm just using white paint that's thinned down with a little bit of water and making straight lines. And I will bring this into real time in just a second here so you can really see how I'm moving that brush. Just little diagonal lines. They don't have to be perfectly straight. You want them mostly straight, but I don't need to sit here with a ruler. I just need to get them going in about the same direction as each other. And I want them, some to be a little bit longer, some to be shorter. Whoops, there, I got a little too thick, so I just wiped that off. With acrylic paint, if you haven't, something happen like that you don't like what it looked like, you can wipe it off as long as the paint hasn't dried yet. Once it dries, you're not going to get it off. You'd have to paint over it if it was something that really needed to be covered. You can put as much rain in here as you want. I want to make sure the bits that look farther away are much lighter. I'm not pushing nearly as hard with the brush, and they're shorter. Then where I want the raindrops that feel closer to you, I'm pushing a little bit harder on the brush to get a thicker line and making each of those strokes a tiny bit longer. Once I get all of the rain in there that I want, I'm going to take a liner brush and I'm going to paint where it looks like the rain is splattering on the horse's back. And to do that, I'm essentially just going to paint a V with a couple of little extra lines coming out of it. And then the rain splashing, a longer raindrop splashing right from the middle. Very, very simple. There's that V. I'm going to put that in a couple of different places. Not too many. Oh, too bright. All I have to do is touch my finger to it to tone those down. The liner brush I don't like as much for creating the straight lines for the rain. It's harder to get a straight line with this than it is a flat brush like the one that I used before. This one, I have a tendency to want to curve the line just a bit. So I don't use it too much when I paint rain. Definitely prefer those straight flat brushes. And that is it for this one. Again, remember to head over to Leonardo's channel, Fine Art Tips, where you can see exactly how to draw your initial outline of the horses before you start painting. And there is my finished painting. I also have a video showing you how to paint fog by using transparent mixing white or even some titanium white instead of the airbrush. I'll have a card pop up so you can check that out if you're interested. Are you done? Are you laughing? This was such a fun collaboration. You guys should all head over to Leonardo's channel and tell him that you want more of these, because I think this is so fun with the drawing section and the painting section. And I'm rambling. If you have not already, there is a subscribe button that you can hit right there to keep up with all 5 of my new art videos every single week. I'll see you tomorrow for the critique video since I switched days this week.